Welcome back to another episode of Obsessed with Death. Thank you so much for continuing to listen and support the podcast. Of course, please tell a friend, spread the word, post on social media. All of that stuff helps a ton. Today, we have Grace Weather on the podcast. She is a 23-year-old award-winning actress, director, a best-selling author, and also a brain cancer legislation advocate. She talks about all the ins and outs of going to the White House, speaking in front of Congress, all in support of funding and helping grow the research of brain cancer. Tumors, especially, any sort of brain cancer, is the funding really doesn't exist like it does for some other major cancers. And I was unaware of that. It's a great episode. You're going to learn a ton. Please enjoy another episode of Obsessed with Death. Thank you for coming on the podcast. I'm obviously very excited to speak to you today. If you wouldn't mind doing like just a quick little who you are and what you do, and we can kind of get into it.
Yeah. So I'm Grace Weather. I am a Los Angeles-based actress, author, and brain cancer advocate. My journey began at 13 when I was diagnosed with a brainstem glioma, which is a tumor in the deepest part of the brain, the pons. I knew nothing about brains before it happened, but now a lot of people joke that like patients have an honorary medical degree in this department. But basically, it's a really difficult tumor to treat. And I was given a very slim chance of surviving, and somehow will have survived 10 years in January. So I have a very weird relationship with time and life and death, obviously. And I've tried to turn that into a career. I guess I have turned it into a career. And now I'm 23 as of last week and living every day.
I mean, congratulations for
Thank you.
the 10 years coming up here. That's very exciting.
Thank you.
Is it
Yeah.
weird? I mean, immediately I'm like, is it weird to be congratulated that you didn't die? Is that just like normal to you at this point?
No, we throw a party every year, me and my friends. Like I feel like I
I
have
love
to
it.
do something to like establish that I'm still. I think what's really weird about it is like most cancer survivors, they celebrate a survival date when they're like cancer free. And I was never given that. It's kind of like if you just like never had a birthday, you just have to like come up with something. And that was kind of how we felt. We were like, okay, well, I still have this tumor. So how are we going to decide to celebrate it? So every year on my diagnosis date, we all get together and we make like cards for the kids in the hospital. And it's a big, big celebration of my life. So yeah, no, we do it every year.
I love that. I love that you also, of course, are so thoughtful in the sense to make cards for other people and also make it about other people. That's great. And to have that group of friends and to be able to do that, it's an interesting thing, right? Because you mentioned birthdays, right? So it's like everyone does sort of have like, oh, you made it another year. You're a year older sort of thing. So you sort of have like two birthdays almost.
I do.
One was obviously when you were born, and then the other was like when you sort of got this diagnosis of, it for it to be 10 years. It's incredible. I mean, that's very exciting.
It's a new life. I mean, it's kind of like it is. It's like my new birthday of my new life because I think it's weird to say it like this, but everything is kind of categorized like before diagnosis and after diagnosis. Like to me, it was that stark of a change in my life.
Yeah.
Just because I was forced to make so many like physical changes with it as well.
Yeah.
And I moved across the country shortly after being diagnosed too. So yeah, it's like my second birthday for my new life for sure.
Yeah. Can't even, you were young when you were diagnosed. 13, is that what you said? 13 years old?
Yeah, so I got really sick and tired around 12 years old, and no doctor could tell me it was wrong. I went to pediatricians who said I was making it up for attention, or I was just depressed, or I was just a teenager. It was about 6 months of going in and out to different specialists who just could not figure out what was wrong with me. And then on January 9th of 2015, when I was 13, they did an MRI of my spine and my skull just to rule everything out. They were kind of going down a list of tests. And by the end of the day, they had found out that I had this mass in my brain. And I was told that the tumor was inoperable, so they couldn't do surgery, which is usually the first step that they take when they find a brain tumor. I was told that chemotherapy and radiation had a very slim chance of working because of this thing called the blood-brain barrier, so no medication could get to the tumor. And I was told that there was really nothing they could do to help me in the hospital. So I was sent home that day. I was told to drink Gatorade because I was passing out like multiple times a day. And they released me. Like that was my last day in the hospital, was the day that I was diagnosed. I was given an 8% chance of survival for 6 months. Most of these tumors, once they start growing, there's nothing they can really do. It starts taking over like your breathing functions and eventually your heartbeat, but it leaves you fully cognitively intact. So I don't have any like cognition issues due to my tumor. It's mostly like physical things. So I had to do like physical therapy for my face because my face started drooping on one side. But basically, it just like leaves you as yourself, but it slowly takes away your body until you eventually pass away from your heartbeat stopping. So I was sent home and told that this was going to happen to me. And I was 13 years old. And they were like, have fun. See ya. Like, come back
Wow.
in 6 months if you're still here and we'll do another scan. So I was put on a wait and watch protocol, which is like considered very dreaded in the medical community.
Yeah.
Basically means they don't do anything and you come back and they scan it again and you find out if it's growing or if it's not growing. And if it's growing, there's nothing they do. And if it's not growing, then you come back again. And so I was put on this plan and I was released back into my life and told to go make memories by the doctors. And I spent 6 months kind of just like waiting. And
Wow.
then it didn't happen, which I think sometimes was even harder than the previous
Yeah.
story I was being told. So yeah, it was a big thing to go through at a very young age. But I actually feel like it might have been a good thing because I think I was a lot more resilient then than I may have been at this age for sure.
The making it up makes me crazy. I mean,
Yeah,
that's insane, but
yeah. It's like, oh, well, and what's even crazier is I was given 6 months to live, and it took them 6 months to find it. So if my tumor had been progressing, like it took you guys 6 months to find it, which means I would have
yeah.
passed away before they found it, which is unfortunately the reality for a lot of families with tumors is like sometimes they don't cause symptoms until it's too late, and they'll find the tumors at autopsy, and the kids will kind of just like pass away in their sleep.
Yeah.
Um, so the fact that it was so difficult to get a diagnosis in the first place, when we finally got that diagnosis, I think there was a bit of a relief and like, oh my God, there is something because we had been knowing that there was something for so long and like fighting a lot of doctors to like give me the test in the first place. There was a weird period where a couple months into like all the testing, my red and white blood cell count came back weird on my blood work that I had done it. Like I went to like an urgent care to test for mono.
Yeah.
And because my red and white blood cell count was so far off, they assumed that I might have leukemia. So I actually became a patient in the cancer department before I even was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And I think having that guidance is what eventually like led me to even being able to get the test of the MRI. But they just didn't necessarily, they're like, you have these symptoms of leukemia, but you don't have leukemia. And so then I got sent home again. And then I would keep coming back and be like, I'm still passing out. Help me,
Yeah, the
please.
Gatorade isn't working.
The Gatorade, like seriously, I'm going to the like the biggest hospitals in the world and they're like, drink Gatorade, I guess.
Crazy. Yeah.
So yeah, no, I was kind of sent on this weird like limbo in between where I knew I was potentially on this path of dying and progressing and then just not really having any help or support from the medical community, which is I usually think you assume if you get diagnosed with something like this that we're in like the 21st century and they just like give you some treatment and you do chemo for 12 weeks and then you have a bald head and you smile and then you go back to school and there's a party. And
Yeah.
what I realized is that's not the reality for a majority of these families. And I've become really integrated in the community and I've seen a lot of families go through this and it's not our reality. So we have a long way to go, but it's been a interesting thing to experience and have to become familiar with for sure.
I want to get into that. I want to hear about, more about the work that you're doing um, with brain cancer specifically. But I'm just curious. You're getting ready to celebrate 10 years. It seems like they really had nothing for you, and now
Yeah.
you're 10 years later. Can they tell you anything now as to like why it hasn't progressed at all, or how you're doing so well? I mean, obviously it's great, but like,
Yeah.
do they even get? Are they any closer to giving you any information 10 years later?
No, they are not. It's
Wow.
I think what's crazy is like, as I've gotten more into like advocacy work, what's insane is Neil Armstrong's daughter Karen died of a tumor in the exact same area of the brain as my tumor in the 1960s. And her dad was going to the moon, but his own daughter was dying on Earth. And since she was diagnosed and passed away with this tumor in this area of the brain, the treatment protocol has not improved or changed since the 1960s when she had it. And now I
Wow.
have it, like what, 80 years later,
Yeah.
and I have the same options that she had back then. I think it's a mix of things. It's an impossible part of the brain. Like they can't even biopsy my tumor. So it's so hard. It's like, it's so dangerous to biopsy it because it controls functions like breathing and my heartbeat. So they would rather just not biopsy it, which means they don't have a genetic makeup of my tumor. I don't know the stage of my tumor. I don't know the exact type. It's just kind of like a generalized, like, oh, this is a glioma in this area of the brain. So it's a brainstem glioma. And so it's just a lot of really unknown things. They don't know what causes brain tumors. They don't know how to cure brain tumors. Most of these tumors have like a 1% survival rate. And I'm in the community. There's like hundreds of us, and you meet these families, and then these kids usually pass away, and like it's like 9 months is the average, and then it's like some people get like 2 to 3 years. There's probably like four of us that I know that are like far out that have had it for a while. But they do not know why my tumor hasn't progressed, and most of my friends did. No one can tell me those answers. It might just be, the cell makeup. Like they genuinely don't know. And the issue is most of the time they can't study it until the child has passed away. So like they can't study my tumor. But they are like
Yeah.
a lot of my friends who have passed away, they're studying their cells in Zurich right now in a lab in Switzerland. And so we're starting to learn more about like certain kids who have lived a lot longer. And there's some experimental trials that have been like very hopeful that are happening, and some new medications, but it's so difficult and they're funded like by parent and parent foundations. Like they're not being funded by the government. So it's so hard to like keep them going. It's every week we get a call being like, hey, this trial with 30 kids in it's about to get shut down. And then all the parents have to like chip in and try to like find $1 million in a week. Like the system is so confusing. So unfortunately, a lot of kids pass away waiting for a trial, or they pass away in a trial that's been paused. So no, long long answer short, my doctors don't know why. And so I just try to take that as like, okay, well, I have to keep doing something. Well, I've got this extra borrowed time I feel like I have. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting kind of limbo in between to be in for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my next question was going to be obviously the only way to study this stuff is after these people pass away. And I don't
Mhm.
know, I don't know. I'm the furthest away from a doctor or a scientist that you could possibly be. So I don't know how much you get from studying someone like that after they passed away, but I would assume, or you would hope, that there would be some sort of information that you would get that could lead to something. And then basically from what you obviously just said, it seems like they're still very much in the beginning stages of even coming up with experimental trials for this.
It's been interesting because 10 years is a long time to be a part of something. And when I was
Yeah.
first diagnosed, it was like nothing. Like there were some kids that were diagnosed before me, and they kind of could just like they would call it like an orphan disease. They're like, there's not enough incentive for like funding for it, and it's considered like rare. But what people don't realize is like all childhood illnesses are pretty much compared like considered rare because there's
Yeah.
not a lot of people in our category compared to like elderly people who have cancer. So it's like, no, brain cancer is the most prevalent and deadliest form of childhood cancer now. It used to be leukemia, and they found incredible treatment opportunities for that, and it has like a really high success rate now. So now brain tumors are the most prevalent and the deadliest, but we're still considered rare because there's a lot of people in the older age categories who are fighting like more common cancers. So we're kind of like we're pushed over here in like our little group. But when you're inside the group, you know that there's a lot of people. So I've learned a lot over the past 10 years. And I do think like it's been interesting to start seeing that like little tiny glimpse of hope. Like I feel like I'm in the middle of like some sort of history that in the future will be talked about. Because when I was
Yeah.
first diagnosed, there was like absolutely nothing. And now there are like different trials. Like my friend Jace Ward was in a trial. He was in a trial called CAR T, and it was like they would do infusions into his brain, and it like basically looked like it was like taking bites out of the tumor.
Wow.
He ended up passing away from a brain bleed. So obviously trials are really difficult to figure out and how far they can push things, but he kind of knew that he was doing it for the younger kids who like didn't have a voice of their own because most of these kids are like 1 to 4 years old.
Yeah.
So he passed away from complications, but before he did, it was like they were actually seeing like regression in his tumor, which like if you would have told someone that when I was first diagnosed, they would have been like, no, that's not going to happen. So,
Wow. Yeah.
so it's like, it's kind of this like race of time. It's like, how far can we treat before the tumor like passes how fast we can do this? So it is like an interesting time that we are starting to see something happen. It's a long process for
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, it blows my mind that the I wanted to speak to you about this. I wanted to learn from you about this. The little bit of research that I did was pretty upsetting. You do sort of just get put in these two situations where you just kind of have to choose. You either just try and find the positive in it, or you just let it kind of take over. I mean, you've done a lot, but you've also gone in the direction of activism for brain cancer. Obviously, I think it would be silly to ask you what inspired you to go in this direction, but was there like a specific moment, or was there something that maybe sort of helped push you to be like, okay, now is my time to start really working towards this cause that I have?
When you're told you have 6 months to live, you live in those like 6 months. You're like, okay, I have these 6 months to like do everything I want to do. So I
Yeah.
moved to Los Angeles. I started like acting and modeling and traveling. And I was like, okay, let me like live my best life. And then you go back for your scan and they're like, it's stable. And they're like, okay, well, great. I have another 6 months. Let's do more of this. I'm having a great time. I'm not going to
Yeah.
school anymore. Like, let's keep
Yeah.
going.
Yeah.
And so then it's a year. And then you're like, okay, well, now I got to start thinking about like rent and like not flying around the world. Okay, let's think about that then. And then it's 2 years, and then it's three. And then you're like, okay, maybe I do need to finish high school because it's been 3 years and I'm still alive. And then it's 4 years, and then you're like, okay, maybe I got to start like being a little normal again. Like it was this really weird transition of like my previous life died in a way,
Yeah.
and I had to like start over and build a new life. But I was at the forefront of my mind was like the fact that I might have a limited amount of time. But eventually that time kind of just like gets longer and longer, and you have to start making like real world decisions again. And so it was somewhere around like a couple years into it. I was probably 15 or 16, and it had been a few years, and I was put in a peer group of like 30 kids when I was first diagnosed. And by this point, I was the only one left from that peer group.
Wow.
So it's like, okay, it's not moving on, but it's just like reevaluating and rebuilding. And I was like, okay, well, maybe I should start talking about this publicly and start trying to kind of remove myself from this like actively sick mindset. My mom, she's a fascinating dynamic because she's a lawyer by day, but like a yogi by night. And so
Okay.
she like has this like very methodical thinking, but also very like spiritual in a way too. So it's like you can be sad, but you can't be sad for too long, is like what she always told me.
Sure.
And so I started kind of like trying to remove myself from that actively sick mindset. I wasn't really going to the hospital much. I was only going for follow-up scans. And it kind of felt there was just like a day where it like felt time like maybe we should start kind of separating a little bit from this. And that was when I started publicly speaking about it because it felt like I wasn't so much like in it. And I'm like looking forward to 10 years as well because I feel like that's going to be another like big like marker for me. Not that anything has changed in the past 10 years. My tumor is still the exact same size, but it just feels like a good benchmark to like step one step further away from like that hospital girl who was like so sick. And so I started speaking about it publicly when I started kind of like removing myself from that sickness patient mindset. And I realized when I started talking about it that although my story was about brain tumors, it felt like it was a lot bigger than that. Like I had a lot of people telling me that I was influencing the way that they just kind of like saw the world and saw life. And I was like 15 and I was like, okay, like sounds good. I guess I'll keep doing this. And I just kept speaking about it and trying to use like brain tumors as an example. Like I feel like my story is just like an extreme example of the experience that all of us live. Like we have to figure out who we are and we have to build a life that feels like our life and isn't just like what we were told to do when we grew up. And so I started speaking about it more and more. And eventually I was invited to Washington, D.C. to speak in front of Congress about it. And I did that when I think I was 17 when I did that for the first time. And I just realized that literally by speaking about the things I had been through, I could influence the future of other kids who were going through the same thing as me and my own future. Because I was still, I'm still looking for a trial, hopefully in the future one day.
Yeah.
And so I just kept going back and kept going back. And there was different laws that I was like, oh, I'm passionate about this one and this one, and just kept going. And then eventually I was appointed chair of a program that was called Teen Track, and it basically invited all of these teens from around the world to come together for a week in Washington, D.C., and they got to sit and speak to the White House staffers about what they needed as cancer survivors and as young people in the medical system. So that's how I got involved in the White House, and it just kept growing and growing. And I realized that it was just too simple not to do it. Like I literally will go up there and speak for like, 5 minutes. And if me doing that can influence like thousands of people's future, then it just felt silly not to do it. And so I just keep showing up as much as I can.
Being 17 years old and being asked to speak in front of Congress is like, I would imagine, relatively intense for a 17-year-old. Where were you comfortable doing? Like, where did that confidence come from?
I don't know. And I'm glad I started at such a young age.
Yeah,
I gave my first TED Talk when I was 15.
I
And
watched it, and
oh,
you speak like you're a 30-year-old who has lived a full life. It's crazy. Just the most elegant and intelligent. It was very impressive. And
thank you.
but the TED Talks were great. I thought they were very interesting. But again, going to Congress and speaking, going to the White House and speaking is got to be another level than a TED Talk. No disrespect to TED Talk, but it's a little more intense. I mean,
Yeah.
you say you don't know where it came from, but I mean, I would assume you're nervous. Well, what were you thinking when you find out you're going to the White House?
Well, but I mean, I've probably spoken like hundreds of times, and I give like keynote speeches that are like an hour long at like corporate events and things like that. So I feel like I've just got like really comfortable. Like I just had to do it. Like I just felt so comfortable by the time I got there. To me, like this thing that I try to live by all the time, like a lot of people are like, oh my God, you're so like brave to do that, or that must have been so scary, like to move across the country and try to pursue things or to, speak in front of Congress.
Yeah,
And to me, the only thing scarier, like than doing those things was the idea that I wouldn't be able to do those things, because I think I still live to this day in this like I have a limited amount of time mindset. And so it's like, okay, well, if I'm invited to do this thing, then like I may not be able to do that thing next year. And so I think to me, I just literally live so day by day, which is a blessing and a curse at times.
yeah,
Um, but when I was invited to do it, I mean, I was not given very much notice for most of these like big things that I do. Like you find out that it's going to the floor and they're like, hey, you gonna be here tomorrow? And I'm like, guess so.
yeah.
Um,
That helps a little bit, I
I
guess.
guess
Right?
that does help a lot too. But yeah, most of the time I'm like writing my speeches on the plane wherever I'm going.
Wow.
And yeah, it just feels like I just feel such a responsibility to speak for so many of my friends that don't have the opportunity to speak. And then I feel a responsibility to speak for my previous self who didn't know I was going to have this time to do these things. And so those things are just so much bigger inside of me and inside of my brain that like any fear that I do have like gets diminished very quickly. So yeah, I don't know. I get like excited about being able to share the story with people and being able to educate new people. And I mean, if anything, it's like sometimes those experiences are more like frustrating when people don't understand why we need the things that we need. I think that's for me the hardest part of the job of advocacy is when you're like, really? You don't understand like the urgency and the need that we have here. Like I feel urgent about this. I'm here. So I think to me it's like it's my job to get this story and get this experience across as clear and concise as I can so that it influences people to join us in this fight and join, the lawmakers who have signed on to like create these pieces of legislation. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's just such a big responsibility that I'm like that just overtakes it all for me. So just get it done.
I feel like there's a reoccurring theme here, and it's frustration, right? It's either the doctors or it's these people, not understanding why these laws need to be passed, or
Mhm.
why you're there to speak and inform people. Do, I mean, this might be a a broad question to ask, and I'm sure there's a lot of different answers. Is there anything specifically to brain cancer that you think, what would be like the top of the list that needs to change in the healthcare system specifically to brain cancer?
Well, I think there's a major lack of funding. Pediatrics in general get like 4% of the government budget, which makes no sense because to me, I think, I mean, pediatric patients are like the future. So I
Yeah.
don't understand why we're pouring so much money into like elderly cancers. No offense to the elderly, but
But
we
they
really
lived a
are.
full life, all right? They had their
Exactly.
chance.
I
I
mean,
get it.
yeah, they've done and I don't know the exact numbers, but I've seen a lot of parents, they like spend the time doing the like math for years lost versus lives lost. And they're
Yeah.
like, our years lost are 100 times what those other cancers are. Like
Wow.
we really like if you take like the lifespan of like the average American and you do the math, these kids are passing away at like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 years old, and then they're being called rare. And you're like, that doesn't make any sense to me. And so I think there's an issue with funding and that we're working on a lot of that. Like there's a bill that focuses on like a research program at NIH and would fund it with over $100 million. So we've been fighting for that. There's also like it's really difficult to communicate because this doesn't have like an FDA approved treatment. Most of it is universities going after different trials and experiments, and a lot of them are paid or like want to publish. So they want to be the first. So there's not necessarily a lot of information sharing between universities, which when I think you're fighting to like get this done as rapidly as possible because there are like lives on the line, keeping information from other people who might need that information doesn't make any sense to me either, but it is a business in some ways, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But there's been a lot of parents who've been working to combat that. Jace, my friend that I spoke about, his mom is working on like a tumor database where parents can submit their kids' data voluntarily after they pass away. So all of that can be in one place. And that's like never existed before. It's really hard because patients can't get care across state lines. So we're working on legislation for that because it's like hard to pass your records from one state to the other. It's like really difficult to change hospitals. Like there are just so many barriers in the way. And when your child's given 6 months to live, and then you're dealing with barriers like you can't get your medical records sent to a new hospital. Like, I just don't understand why there's so many roadblocks in the way to treatment, especially when the treatment already has a slim chance of working. So there's a lot of different
Yeah.
ads,
Wow.
but what I think is really incredible is these parents, unfortunately, a majority of them have lost their children. Their like life mission after that is like, how can we fix these roadblocks that affected our family during our treatment time? So they're building databases, they're communicating with families, they're building tumor boards that will review your tumor for free. They're like they are doing everything they possibly can to make this experience better for other families because the last thing when your child is at end of life that you should be dealing with is like trying to figure out how to get records. So the real heroes in this situation, I think, are these bereaved parents, and they are really, really badass parents for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine finding the motivation to do anything after losing a child, and
It's
these
crazy.
people are like working on changing the world.
I mean, I go to Washington, D.C. and I'm on the Hill, and these parents are sometimes like a week out from losing
Wow.
their kids. And
Oh,
they're like,
yeah.
I just couldn't not come. I think it's just that to me is the hardest part of all of this. It's like coming to terms with my own death is its own thing. That was, I was very young. So I think I went through that pretty quickly and I don't remember much those 6 months. But I think for me, the hardest part is like having to watch these parents who because everyone's like, oh my God, you're so lucky that you lived. You like, you were out living and you fought so hard and it worked. And I'm like, these kids were fighting just as hard as I was. My friends didn't want to die either. Like they were
Yeah.
like, oh, well, you chose to live. I'm like, they wanted to live too. And I think these parents who just have to like sit back and watch it happen and there's nothing that they can do, to me, that's been like the most difficult thing to process is like they really like there's nothing they can do and they just have to watch their kids pass away. And with this illness, like towards end of life, they change a lot physically. Like a lot of them are on steroids, so they get like really puffy and they gain a lot of weight. Most of them can't walk, they can't breathe well, so some of them have breathing tubes. Like they just don't look like their child at
Yeah.
all. And the whole time they're cognitively intact and aware of what's happening the entire time. And so seeing these parents that are so close to death and then like on the hill talking about their kids. And
Yeah.
it's like, I just think that's the most incredible thing and like the most heartbreaking thing I've ever had to witness. And I don't understand how they do it. But there has to be something in that experience that makes them that way, that makes us patients that way, because every single one of them is there. And some of them have a hard time talking about their kid, but they still will show up and be in the back of the room just like quiet, but they're still there. And
Yeah.
I've always found that fascinating. There's something about that process of death that has just like instilled something in all of these parents to just like be like, I'm going to show up. And they really do. They all show up. Like we know most of these kids because most of them kind of all call like the same group of like nonprofits or, parent leaders. And so we know a majority of people diagnosed and they show up in the hundreds to DC and it's the most amazing thing. And they do this like beautiful thing each year where like they line up all of their kids' shoes in front of the Washington Monument and it's just like it's incredibly beautiful. But yeah, no, they all have the same perspective and the same outlook. And I just have to assume that it comes from experiencing a death that close to you.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that maybe a part of it is obviously being so powerless with their child being sick
Hmm.
that they kind of get their power back by going to these events and, advocating for their kid and for other kids. I would, that's just, I would hope healing in some way for them, right? Like I can't imagine ever being the same from that, but having some sort of motivation or some sort of goal to set for yourself that's going to, maybe fight, what
Yeah.
took your kid would help. I would maybe a little, I guess. Um, yeah. Wow. That's a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. Do you think about what your life is like now and do you think you would have had a similar life if you never had this diagnosis? You would have just kept going to school? Do you think, I mean, you said you just sort of just packed your backpack and went to LA. Like, was that always the plan? Were you going to do that anyway?
It was my plan. It was my
Okay.
12-year-old pop star dream plan, but I don't know
Yeah.
if that would have happened in that way. I think
Well,
I
sure, you weren't going to leave at 12, but I mean, maybe, you graduate high school or college, and then, I mean, do you think you would
yeah,
have still had a similar life?
probably, but I think I think what it did is it forced me to do the things that I always wanted to do. And I think a lot of different experiences in life do that, whether it's like a family death or a divorce or an illness of some sort. And it really what it was is it just like it took away all of the things that my mom and I thought were so mandatory. It's just me and my mom, and it's like, okay, you're in dance and you go to dance 4 days a week, and then you're in figure skating, you go to that the other 3 days a week, and you train for 12 hours a day, and then you get sick the next day, and you're like, why am I doing all this? Like, I am 12 years old. This is not the Olympics. Like, we're
Yeah.
not like all of these things that, and we would get, you're like driving to sports and you're so angry because you're late, and then you're mad you didn't win the competition, or like you have a quiz at school, and it's just like all of these things that seem so mandatory and so stressful were like stripped away from me in one day. Like I school was kind of like, please don't send her back. She's having seizures and passing out in class. Like this is a spectacle.
Yeah.
So I started homeschooling and I couldn't do my sports anymore. And I was just kind of left with like nothing except sitting in my room. And my mom filled my room, thankfully, with like art supplies. And I had a guitar and I had records in my room that I would listen to. And it was just like, it really was like that question that they sometimes ask people where they're like, if you were in a room with nothing and you were just by yourself, like who would you be? And I feel like I was put through that experiment. I was left alone in a room and I was
Hmm.
like, who
Yeah.
am I? And I think I was young enough to still remember those passions. Like I always said that I was going to move to LA and work in entertainment, but who knows, like from age 11 to age 21, like a lot happens in there and a lot of pressures are put on you to like make money and go to college and all of these things. And so I always just say it forced me to live the life I should have been living. And it was like it forced me to be my true self and like rebuild from ground zero. And I was young enough and naive enough to be like, I want to be in the entertainment industry. And we rented an apartment over the phone, which I don't recommend doing. And
Yeah.
we started flying to LA on the weekends, and I eventually like quickly got signed and like ended up building a career in the entertainment industry. And so I don't know what my trajectory would have looked like, but I think it just like allowed me to pursue my passions from a very young age. So I always say like, although it's the hardest thing I've ever had to go through, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. And I know a lot of families probably don't agree with that, but for me personally, like it's awful and I would not wish it on anybody, but it was an incredible moment in my life to like rebuild and be the person that I probably should have been. Because I was, I was in middle school at the time and I was being bullied really bad in school. And I was trying to be my true self in school and I would like put on plays and I would wear weird outfits to school and all the kids are like, this girl is weird. And then I was diagnosed and suddenly I had the freedom to be that. And who knows how long, I would have kept doing those weird things that everyone made fun of if I would have had to stay in school and continue on into high school. So I kind of like escaped the bullies and then just went off and did my weird thing on my own in Los Angeles. And now it'll be 10 years of doing my weird thing on my own. So, yeah.
I love that. Yeah, I don't know. I always so it's I feel like everyone sort of thinks about obviously, oh, my life could have been so different, or if this one thing happened, all of this could have changed. When it's something as extreme as what you went through, I think it's always it's interesting to see where that takes people. And
Yeah.
for you at such a young, I guess being young, I think is a big part of it too, right? Because how great is it to just be young and incredibly just like delusional and naive and just think that you could do anything?
Best.
Isn't it the best?
The best.
I miss it so much. I'm a bit older than you. I just turned 37 in July, and I'm very lucky. I'm very happy and all those things, but I do sort of miss sometimes and think about like my even just my early 20s where I'm like, man, I would just do whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted, and a consequence never even crossed my mind.
Yeah.
It's mind blowing just how incredibly delusional I was while
Mhm.
somehow also just having the best time ever.
Yeah.
There is something kind of beautiful about that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a million things that I could talk to you about. I do want to mention you have a book out. It was when we were sort of emailing back and forth about having you on the podcast. You're so many things. You're also an author. I
Mhm.
mean, I would love to hear about the book, but I would also just love to hear like when did you start writing and where did that all start?
Yeah, well, so I put out a really mediocre book when I was 16 that has a lot of
Okay.
typos. A lot of typos, but what had started was when I first gave like my TED talk and I first started talking about what I had been through, I wanted to write my experiences somewhere, just like document them. And I
Yeah.
was like, of course, young and naive and thought I could do anything. I was like, I'm gonna write a book.
Of course, now I'm an author. Now I'm an author.
Obviously.
Yeah.
And I started writing it, but what I realized was that my brain tumor story did not tell the whole story, because I hadn't been through chemo, I hadn't been through surgery, and there was a lot of other people who had been through those things and could tell what that experience was like. So
Yeah.
what I started doing was I actually went on the internet and I searched hashtag brain tumor and I looked for other survivors around the world that were kind of actively telling their stories. I had found a lot of like parents who were telling their young children stories on like Facebook and stuff just to kind of like inform family and friends, and then it kind of like would get bigger and bigger. But it was hard to find young people my age that were actively telling their stories. I found like although most of these parents are very vocal and I think that's like a support tool in a way to find other people online, most of like the teen patients were not talking about it at all. I actually met one of my best friends in science class named Gigi, and my eyes started twitching in my homeschooling science group with 4 kids in it. And I was like, sorry guys, I have a brain tumor. I'm fine. And this girl leaned across the table and said, I have a brain tumor too. And I just
Wow.
went through surgery a few weeks ago. There was 4 of us. So we were joking like 50% of our class now has brain tumors. And she had never told anyone. She had just left school and was
Yeah.
homeschooling. And, like it was just something she didn't really share. And then I asked her if she would write a chapter for my book. And I found that that was like the reality. I mean, most of the kids were getting bullied because they'd have some sort of like physical deformity from their tumor. And it just seemed like it was a very secretive thing, which I had always talked about it very publicly. So I was like, maybe I can, and these teens aren't even talking to their parents about it. So it was like, maybe I can create some sort of conversation in a book that just like is a way to start teens thinking about the fact that there's other people going through this too, and just start talking about it. So I put together like all of these chapters from different survivors at different stages of treatment and one or two parents in there as well, because I thought that was an interesting perspective. And we packaged it into this like little book, and I self-published it, and we started giving them away to hospitals and having like doctors hand them to newly diagnosed patients. And so that was the story of the first book. And that was really how I started building like this cancer community online. Was like a lot of people would be like, I was diagnosed and I was given your book by my doctor. And I think just having that conversation openly was so awesome. And I found what was so interesting when I like sit back and like read that book from start to finish now is although we all had very different experiences with our brain tumor journeys, we all kind of ended on the same perspective of like living every day, and as cliche as it sounds, but just like a different perspective of the world and the fact that nothing was scarier than what we had already been through. So most of us were, deciding not to go to college, pursuing like more creative careers that we were passionate about and doing things just like a little differently than our peers on different timelines. And I think that's such a big blessing that most brain tumor kids are given. My new book, Seven Thompson and the Art of Remembering, basically I was like, how can I make this perspective that most of these cancer teens have and make it a more universal story that's not about brain tumors? So this new book is basically the terminally ill kid perspective injected into non-terminally ill characters, is how I like to describe it. And so it's a lot about the contemplation of life and death and the perspective of choosing to see the world in a beautiful way. I think that's like, for me, that was the biggest thing, is if I could tell myself that this brain tumor that I went through was the best thing that ever happened to me and like genuinely believe it, which I don't know when that shifted, but somewhere in there, like day by day, it became that. I was like
Yeah.
extremely grateful for it. And I was like, if I could do this with the hardest thing I've ever had to face, I'm sure I can do it with little things in my life too. And I think once I made that like decision, I just started seeing the world in like such a beautiful way and being so grateful for everything and just seeing art in everything. And I think that made me the creative that I am today. And it influences all of my work in the entertainment industry. And I just decided to not see things with anger and hate. Because I think that's so hard is when you're first diagnosed and you're told you have 6 months to live, you're so angry. You're like, I'm in seventh grade, or I'm in college, like some of my friends, or I'm 6 years old, and you're looking at your 6-year-old, and it's like, why them? Like, why
Yeah.
do they not have the full amount of time that everybody else has? And so I think your first emotion when you think about death or death coming too soon is like anger, and just so angry about something because you can't control it. For me, getting out of that trap of anger was like a really big thing that I focused on, and a big thing that my mom really focused on too was like, you can be mad, but you can't be mad for too long. And you can be sad, but you can't be sad for too long. And she just kept saying that over and over and over again. And so it wasn't, ignoring my emotions that I had been through. It was just allowing me to know that I could move beyond them. And then slowly the world started looking more beautiful and I got more grateful. And then I wanted to share that perspective with people who didn't necessarily even care about brain tumors. And so that was with this book, that was my goal. And I posted like an excerpt on TikTok and it got like 10 million views in like a day. And I realized that it was a conversation that people do want to have. Like people are thinking about death. We're on obsessed with death right now. Like people are thinking about these things, and it's just not something that I think is talked about. And it's something that just kind of like goes to the back of our mind. But I think I've just been forced to live a life where death and legacy and living is at the forefront of my mind every day. I'm reminded constantly that we have a limited amount of time. We all have a limited amount of time, not just me. Like that, like we all have a limited amount of time, and you could die before I die. Like we don't know what's happening just because I have a brain tumor, but I'm just forced to think about it more frequently than other people. So when it comes to pursuing things or trying things that are scary, I think I'm just forced to do them a lot quicker than other people because I get worried that I won't have the chance to do them at all. Which was a
Yeah.
really long answer to saying that my book is about the perspective that I've gained through this cancer experience without cancer being a part of it. So, yeah.
I love the answer. Please
Thanks.
Do not, yeah, don't apologize for that. You mentioned TikTok, and I am sort of curious your thoughts on, you talk about how you were sitting next to a friend and had no idea they had a brain tumor, and there
Yeah.
was like sort of this secrecy or privacy around having brain tumors, and nobody's talking about it. And
Yeah.
now I feel like, I mean, my algorithm is just like all death stuff. So I see a lot of people who are going through chemo or at a funeral or all these things, and I feel like at least the people that are on TikTok are less private, less secretive about their diagnosis or whatever that is. And
Yeah.
I see it as a positive, right? Because it does get people talking about death and thinking about it and having these difficult conversations. But I'm curious about your thoughts on, people sharing and telling stories through TikTok or even just posting a photo of a family member going through it. I mean, it seems like a positive thing to me, but I'm curious, what your thoughts are on that.
To me, I think it's vital to people who aren't able to post right now. And I think that's the reality for like a lot of families. Like sometimes it's not the time to be posting. And I think Instagram started to have it a little bit, and Facebook has really opened up with like a lot of like moms who talk about their kids who are going through it. But I think TikTok's just a whole nother level of authenticity. Like the way that I talk on TikTok is not the way that I talk on other social media platforms. And I think it's because I've been able to reach audiences on there that are open to having like really authentic conversations about this and want to learn from other people. And people will just go back and forth in my comments for like days on end, and I'll just be like scrolling through looking at them like
Yeah.
I just think it's so interesting that you can cultivate a community that wants to have a conversation on TikTok. I don't post very often, but when I feel inspired to post something, I just kind of like throw it out there. And it usually, it's a mix of people who are like, hey, I went through this, and to see this is life-changing, mixed with just like people who have never heard about these tumors and are just like, I find this fascinating and it's changed my outlook on my life today. I'm like, if I can change your life for today, that's great. Like I've done something positive with my day. Yeah, no, I think it's a really awesome place. I mean, obviously it comes with a lot of negativity sometimes too, and even I get a lot of hate
Yeah.
comments on there, but I think just to have like that place where you can start that open dialogue about it and realize that a lot of people are thinking about these things whether they say them or not. Like their dog is being posted on Facebook, but then on TikTok they're talking about, death and how long we have to live. But I think it's really awesome when you can find a community that wants to talk about these things. And I think that was a big thing with like my book too, like that whole process, like it was going to a lot of industry people who were like, hey, so like these characters are 17 and they're talking about mortality, like this isn't realistic. You got to like tone it back. And
Wow.
I'm like,
Yeah.
they're like, well, they just wouldn't talk like that. They're talking like philosophers and they're 17. Like this is not a teen coming of age book. Like we need more romance. And I'm like, these are the conversations that I would have wanted to have when I was 17. Like if
Yeah.
I could have a place that discussed like the point of living and why I was on this earth for the first place. Like I think being a teenager is difficult. Being any age is difficult. Being an adult is difficult. Like there's
Life is difficult.
life is difficult. There's no manual to this. It's all just like people pretending they know it's happening.
Yeah.
And so to have those conversations of like, why am I here? Why am I doing this? And I think cancer patients are an incredible place for that conversation to start because we have to talk about those things. We have social workers asking us like, hey, do you want to have kids in 20 years? We have to do something about that now, or you're not going to be able to
Wow.
have them.
Yeah.
Like, or you're in a peer group and they're like, hey, who here has been bullied? Or who here doesn't think they're going to make it to college? And every single person in the circle raises their hand. And so I always just say, like, I think this is an extreme example that we can use to open this dialogue about it with everyone because everyone's going to die. Sorry,
Yeah.
but it's
Yep.
true,
Yep. Spoiler.
and everyone's living and no one really fully asked to be here. So it's kind of just like, how can we kind of make this experience less lonely for people? And I feel like if my TikToks can do that for some people who are talking in the comments, or my book can do that for some teenager that doesn't, know if they want to live anymore, then I feel like we're starting some sort of conversation. Because I think as long as we're not lonely in this experience, we're on the right track for sure. Because I think life in general can be such an isolating thing because you've only ever been yourself. So yeah, just starting that conversation. And I've been lucky to be able to do that with my TikTok platform for some people, for sure.
I do love TikTok. It is crazy at times, but there is
Yeah.
a lot of good in it for sure. All right, you've been very generous with your time. I know it's been an hour basically already. I could talk to you forever. But there's just two quick things. First, if people want to check out your books, where are we sending them? Where do they go for book related stuff?
Seven Thompson and the Art of Remembering is available on Amazon and Barnes& and Noble. If you do Amazon, it'll come like tomorrow. And then if you're interested in reading some survivor stories, my first book is called You're So Lucky. Warning, there's typos, but I thought it kind of made it authentic and cool. So yeah, that's just a collection of different cancers, brain tumor survivors, telling their story as well. So yeah, those are those. And my social media is just at Grace Weather, Wethor.
Awesome. And then just quickly here too,
Yeah.
what could people do to help out with the brain cancer community with, the what all the stuff that you're doing right now? If I'm just like a single person at home, how could they help you? What could they do?
There's a revolving door of legislation. It resets every year, which is another really difficult part of the process.
Right.
But you can call your state representatives. A lot of people don't know that, but they all have offices and they all have phone numbers. You can, call your Congress members and you can ask them if they're currently supporting any pediatric cancer legislation. You can look up pediatric cancer legislation, and all you have to do is call and urge them to become sponsors of the bill, and they can just like sign on. It's as simple as that. And most of these bills, if you get over a certain number of people sponsoring them and signing on to them, they like get a spot on the floor. So yeah, you can call your representatives, and I think that's like our biggest step that we need to take right now is to be able to get funding and these laws passed from our government to be able to make it easier for these young people to get treatment. So yeah, call your reps. And it's kind of fun. You can write them letters too if you want, physical letters. But yeah, what people don't realize is, and I didn't realize this either, is you can have an impact on your government. Like the government is there for us to be able to have a voice. And just by calling reps and getting people to sign on, you can actually make a difference in a vote. So yeah, highly recommend looking into that if you're interested in getting more involved in the advocacy side. Yeah.
Um, well, hey, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I going back to TikTok, I randomly found you on the internet and
Awesome.
was so excited that I got an email back when I reached out, and I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I'm so excited for you to celebrate 10 years in
Yeah.
January, and I can't wait to just continue to watch what you're doing here. And yeah, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad it worked out.